Good afternoon, everybody, and a huge welcome to our webinar this afternoon. We're delighted to welcome you to a webinar that's covering clinical trials, and we're going to look at the patient and clinician experience. So this is really an opportunity to introduce you to our speakers. So you'll guess from the fact I'm talking already that I'm the chair for this afternoon. I'm also the chair of CLL Support, so I'm Hilary Lindsay. We've got two speakers with us today who are ideally qualified to participate in a webinar on this particular topic. So Dr. Kennedy is a hematologist with long-standing involvement as a principal investigator in multiple CLL-related clinical trials over a period of over 25 years. He also has a sustained interest in doctor-patient communication. Dr. Kennedy has worked for many years with the Health Research Authority on research ethics committees and is committed to promoting patient and public involvement and engagement in clinical trials in partnership with CLL Support. I'll tell you a bit more about what we've been doing in this space later on this afternoon. John Greensmith is the Vice Chair of CLL Support, and in that role he has been an extremely efficient patient advocate, not least as he was diagnosed with CLL over 30 years ago, so has enormous experience of being a patient, which he has shared and benefited many others of us as a result. And as John quite often mentions, he's been longer with CLL than he's been without CLL. Ben and John are both members of the STAR group. It's a group we've set up CLL Support last year. It stands for Studies, Trials and Research. And I'll tell you a little more about that later on this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Hilary and CLL Support, for the opportunity to be here. It's a great pleasure to be with you today to talk about a really, really fascinating subject. My role in this is to introduce some jargon, and I'm hoping that John's going to be able to knock all that down so we can start talking about some sensible things in relation to clinical trials. And I think there's a specific and particular thank you to those people who have been involved in studies as well, because the amount that you contribute cannot be understated. The understanding of CLL as a disease is very much down to you and your families in terms of pushing things forward. So the whole idea of research is really to make things better. That's the whole idea. It should be people-centered. So in other words, all about the participants. It's not all about the science. Now, the science is important and questions of scientific importance are central to a good clinical trial. But I think the guiding principles of what is relevant both to treating clinicians and particularly to participants is absolutely paramount and must be at the heart of any good study. So, what is a good study? What's the most important thing, and how do we work in partnership with people to make sure clinical studies work well? So why do we have them? It's primarily to make life better for those people who enter the clinical studies, not to make my life better in any way. And clinical trials must be conducted within quite a strict framework. It's not guidance, there's law and legislation, both national and international. Good clinical practice is a thing. Good manufacturing practice about how drugs are made and presented to us and delivered, given. And there's a research ethics framework. And we're going to talk about some of these, unpack it a little bit. It's not about experimentation on people. There are no guinea pigs involved in any of this. It's about how can we make life better. And it's about building on an evidence base so that we can understand the benefits of treatment and understand the nature of a disease better. It facilitates drug licensing, of course, and that's something that's important and at the heart of a multinational pharmaceutical company must also be its shareholders, and that it's got to make money somehow. But it's at the heart of that is drug development, and that costs an awful lot of money. Clinical trials are absolutely essential to show the evidence to the licensing and regulatory authorities so that it can be approved internationally, US and the FDA, in Europe, and by the MHRA here in the UK. It provides a resource for the funding bodies such as the Cancer Drugs Fund, NICE, for example. And really importantly, it's a resource of biological samples so that we can understand the biology of a disease. Future research, biobanking. So we'll probably come on to some of those as well. So how does it all start? Where does the trial come from? Lots of moving parts and all of that. You've got to have an idea. Somebody's got to work up the statistics. Somebody's got to carry the can for it. Somebody's got to fund it and provide all the money and approve it at various different levels. Within the UK, the CLL study group is now aligned with the CLL Forum, which is really our educational and professional body that we set up more than 20 years ago to collaborate together and build clinical studies, share knowledge, educate, and encompass a wide range of people, not just clinicians and scientists, but patient representative groups as well. The CLL study group is now, as I say, part of the CLL Forum. It meets 2 or 3 times a year, led by Professor Piers Patton at King's, and we have a sort of a developing portfolio of clinical studies. There are smaller individual investigator-led studies, perhaps PhDs or postdoc studies that require individual grants, might be at one centre. And then there are big commercial studies as well, often led and sponsored by multinational pharmaceutical companies. So, okay, quantum leap. You've got it, there's the study, it's in front of you. What do you see? Yes, there are lots of steps involved in setting it up, but there are steps before you can join a study as well. So you've got to find out about it. So scrabbling around, where is the study? What are the options? Where are they? Who's doing it? Often it's the treating clinical team that might introduce it. There may be websites, CLL support, for example, CLL Forum, clinicaltrials.gov is worth looking at. There may be local information, emails, posters, or often word of mouth. So what you're going to receive as part of this, there's going to be supporting documentation, a patient information sheet containing hopefully as much information as you need to be able to make up your mind, whether it's something that you want to or not, plus the opportunity to discuss it further with any of the clinical team, the research team. There's an informed consent process. After that, it's about, do you fit into the study, the eligibility check, and then you're in. Is it really as simple as that? Well, of course, it isn't always quite as simple as that. I think one thing that's worth noting is this thing called eligibility, and you have to forgive me for the jargon because the language is really important here, how we match up our language together and try and interpret and dovetail what we mean. But eligibility can be positive and negative. So it means that there are some things you must have, the inclusion criteria. So it has to be the right diagnosis, the right treatment history, and things you mustn't have. You're not allowed to have some kind of other active cancer or trial drug. Overall fitness is usually got to be quite good to be into a clinical study. Other health problems should be limited, and they're often listed. You can't be allergic to the drug in question. And investigators can't just enroll someone if they want to be in a study or if the consultant wants them to be in the study. We really have to match people up carefully. So the clinical study group is often quite narrow in compared with real-world patient groups. So it's interesting that there are wider issues here at stake. And as I say, consent is taken before you match up the eligibility, which is interesting. So that's for later. John, over to you.
So I'm just going to introduce it from a patient perspective. Now, my first admission here is that to the best of my knowledge, well, I know for sure, I actually haven't been on a clinical trial in terms of trying out a particular medication. However, I have been on taken part in trials where my data has been used. And we'll talk about this as the session progresses. First of all, in terms of my first experiences with trials, my opinion with regard to trials was slightly skewed. Quite a number of years ago, I was beginning cycle 1 of FCR, and I was an inpatient overnight in a multi-bedded ward. And I noticed that evening, a trials nurse coming to talk to one of the other patients, I should say. And, public wards, all that's separating you is a very thin curtain, and there really isn't much privacy. And the clinical trials nurse was telling that patient that another patient on the same trial had recently passed away. And this certainly skewed my very limited and blinkered view of clinical trials. I kind of thought of them as an option of last resort, and nothing could be further from the truth. It is a classic example of a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. And certainly from my experience, and I've been involved in a whole host of clinical trials from a patient perspective in the supporting the trials management group, the patient is not disadvantaged in any way whatsoever. And in fact, you can get an opportunity to get access to a medication that in normal circumstances within clinics, you wouldn't get access to. Yes, there are patient access schemes and the Cancer Drug Fund as well as that, but certainly trials are very much an open and honest way of experiencing some new medication. There's loads of acronyms, unfortunately, associated with trials, and one of them is PPIE, which is Patient and Public Involvement and Engagement. And at CLL Support, we are much more involved nowadays, say compared to 5-6 years ago, in these groups that advise the clinicians and pharma setting up trials. And we get the opportunity to review documentation and make sure that the documentation is written in a patient-friendly way. It is so easy to get really stuck into all of the medical terms, and very quickly, as patients who are not qualified clinicians, we can switch off. But having a plain English summary of trial documentation is essential to ensure that a potential trial participant and their partner have an opportunity to review the documentation, understand exactly what it is that they might be signing up to, and feel comfortable in so doing. So, Ben, if you're ready to crack on, I'll hand the baton back to you.